I'm Dr. Julie Byrne, Chair of the Department of Religion here at Hofstra University. This is our annual Critical Spiritualities lecture and also a small department awards ceremony. Most importantly, however, we are honored to welcome Dr. Robert P. Jones to campus, and I look forward to our conversation, Understanding Christian Nationalism and the Fault Lines of the 2024 election. On behalf of my colleagues in the Department of Religion and the program in Jewish Studies, I want to welcome all our students, staff, faculty, and community members to this event. Thank you again for joining us. I also want to thank our many co-sponsors, most particularly the Hofstra Cultural Center. Atheline Collins, Carol Mallison, and Janine Rinaldi obviously always do the most amazing job taking care of every little thing. And I won't read the list of the many co-sponsors by departments, entities on campus, programs, but we had a lot of support for this event. I do want to call out the St. Louis University Center for Lived Religion, Center on Lived Religion, which provided external funding for this event, and that's greatly appreciated. The Department of Religion is a small but mighty band of people that work together, starting with our special assistant, our specialized student assistant, Ritika Singh, who's in the back and can give you information on all our spring 2025 courses and answer any questions about the department. Our senior assistant to the Department of Religion is Erica Bosco, who you will meet in Hager Hall whenever you come visit. And the Religion and Jewish Studies faculty are Balbinder Bogle, Ann Berline, myself, Warren Frasina, Rachel Gostenhofer, Sophie Hawkins, Elsa Marti, Santiago Slavadsky, John Tian, and Phyllis Zagano. I know it's dark, but still briefly, can the faculty please stand and just wave? There you go. You know your professors. We also have amazing students in our department, and I'm so proud to announce that these awards were already given, but we have a moment to recognize the awardees. So for the Hofstra Cultural Center Judaic Studies Endowed Scholarship, this year they were awarded to Annabelle Gantz and Aaron Glassman. Congratulations, and if you're here, you can stand and wave to Aaron and Annabelle. The Bindra Bursary Awards were also given this past year, and I'm proud to say they were awarded to Mia Chan, Kevin Dolan, Jude Mason, Gabrielle Pierce, Bianca Roque, Ritika Singh, and Jagjot Tamber. Congratulations to all of you too. Also, the members of the Hofstra Religious Mapping Project team have variously gotten, over the last 2 years, awards from the Research Assistant Program of the Rabinowitz Honors College, Firestone Fellowships, Department of Religion Research Assistantships, and peer teacher positions. They are Abigail Anderson, Dylan Boudou, Elizabeth Hennessy, Nicholas Lucetto, Andrew Sine, and Grace Varnum. Congratulations to all of you as well. We are in this moment just a week or two away from the start of registration for spring 2025 classes. And as I mentioned, all of our flyers for the courses we're offering in the spring are in the back. Take a look if you are registering for spring classes soon, if you need a HP distribution, a CC distribution, if any of the classes look interesting. This particular class is new and should be really amazing. I'll be teaching a class that's an extension of the Hofstra Religious Mapping Project, an experiential learning class that is basically half in the classroom and half out in the field visiting religious organizations and sites in the area. And so definitely check this out too as a new experientially focused, community-oriented way to learn about religion. Flyer is back there as well. If you are interested in religion after taking a few courses, if you find yourself hooked, as some of our majors and minors have found they get hooked, the BA in Religion and Contemporary Issues is really easy to double major because you can take 9 credits of whatever your other major is and bring it right into the Religion and Contemporary Issues major. We also believe that religion is crucial to the study of any career path: business, law, health, media, journalism, anything that you're pursuing in the future. You need to understand religion to be a person who can interact with all the clients, employees, fellow workers who you'll be involved with, and to just understand the kinds of issues that arise in the contemporary multicultural workplace. So we've tailored the major to be really easy to pair with what you're doing for your career and to add religious literacy as a component to it. Check it out if you're interested. We adore all our majors and minors in the department, and this is the full list of those who are majoring or minoring in religion and contemporary issues or in Jewish studies. And one more round of applause just for the whole religion department. You all are great. One more thing about our students is that they are, of their own accord, getting together a new club called the Resonance Club. This is entirely a student initiative, entirely student-led, entirely student-organized, but I am so happy to put up the QR codes because they are gathering names of other people who would be interested. Feel free to contact the Resonance Club if you're interested, and thank you very much for all of these initiatives and introductions. And we are on to now our main event. So we are welcoming Dr. Robert Jones, and just before I get to the introduction of our speaker, I would like to say 2 more things, which is one, that Dr. Jones and I will end our conversation so that there is plenty of time for your questions and answers, and that will take place with the line up at the central mic. There's a mic in the middle of the central aisle, so if you are interested in asking a question, please just line up there, and we will take as many questions as we can. And please, students have priority to ask questions first, so students first for the questions part of things. And Dr. Jones is the best-selling author, award-winning author of several books, 2 of which are for sale in the back, and he has graciously agreed to sign some books at the end of our session. So we will break for Dr. Jones to make his way to the back, where the Hofstra bookstore, thank you very much, has set up a book display with paperback and hardback copies of 2 of his books. Thank you very much. And now I have the great pleasure of introducing our esteemed speaker, Dr. Robert Jones. Dr. Jones is the president and founder of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, which is one of the most important sources for data on U.S. religion and politics, trusted by scholars and journalists alike. Dr. Jones is also an award-winning and best-selling author who writes for The Atlantic, Time Magazine, and other outlets. He is frequently featured in major national media such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. His books and public appearances focus on the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity, and he writes a weekly Substack newsletter. This is whitetolong.net, The weekly Substack newsletter is white2long.net, for everyone dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. Dr. Jones holds a Ph.D. in religion from Emory University and is active in his field, serving on the National Program Committee for the American Academy of Religion. This committee is incidentally where Dr. Slobodsky and I both first had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Jones. He has served on the editorial boards of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, as well as of Politics and Religion, a journal of the American Political Science Association. Jones founded PRRI in 2009 and served as its CEO and now its president. Before that, he worked as a consultant at several think tanks in Washington, D.C. Personally, I have read Dr. Jones' work, listened to Dr. Jones speak on radio and TV, and listened to his podcast called The Convocation Unscripted. He offers a brilliantly illuminating view of how our national political landscape is unintelligible without also understanding religion. Indeed, it is impossible to talk about the current U.S. political moment without what we in the Department of Religion call religious literacy, knowing the history of religion, how it operates in public spaces, how it interacts with all of our institutions, and how being able to have informed conversations about religion is part of what it means to be a global citizen in these intense times. Dr. Jones personally exemplifies the way in which the study of religion is critical to professional pursuits like careers in health, law, media, business, in his case, a career in scholarship, media politics, and nonprofit entrepreneurship and management. We are so honored to have Dr. Jones with us at Hofstra today. Let us give a warm welcome to Dr. Robert P. Jones. High in the bright lights now. So, Dr. Jones, there are so many questions that arise from the headlines as we head into the 2024 election. Religious affiliation and its effects on the abortion debate, on immigration policy. Several states recently passed laws mandating the posting of the Ten Commandments or teaching Bible in public schools. These things seem to have something to do with Christian nationalism and the fault lines of the 2024 election. And I hope we get to all of these issues. But I want to start with a basic framing question. Your organization, PRRI, has conducted numerous polls to discern patterns of attitude of U.S. voters. What have you discovered about the phenomenon of Christian nationalism? And why is it important to understanding the landscape of the 2024 presidential election?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here tonight with all of you. I've had kind of a full day already. I've met many of you in the room, either over lunch or in other conversations around the campus. So I appreciate your hospitality and having me here, and glad to be in conversation with you. So I'll start with the word Christian nationalism and maybe unpack that a little bit. It's a relatively new word that's been used by journalists, sociologists, to describe actually something that's quite old in America. So there's a kind of new manifestation of it, but it's essentially a claim that this country is of, by, and for Christians. And typically that means Christians of European descent, right? That's essentially its basic claim. In my most recent book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, I basically do a 500-year sweep of history showing like moments where that has appeared kind of throughout our history. But today, we're measuring it very specifically with kind of sociological measures. So we just released a survey a few weeks ago, which is our latest update on these measures. But we essentially measure this by a set of questions that we ask on public opinion surveys. And we ask people whether they agree or disagree with a number of questions, not just one, but several questions that are things like, the U.S. should declare itself to be a Christian nation. U.S. laws should be based on the Bible. If we move away from our Christian foundations, we won't have a country anymore. Christians should exercise dominion over other citizens, right, in the country. So there are questions like that. And when we combine them all together into kind of one big composite measure and then kind of look at the patterns, what we basically see is that about 3 in 10 Americans either fully adhere to those statements or agree with them, but maybe not as strongly. But there's a kind of about 3 in 10 Americans who we classify as either Christian nationalism adherents, those who fully agree with all those statements, or sympathizers, those who agree but not as strongly. And then the rest of the country, 6 in 10, like 2/3 of the country, are what we classify as Christian nationalism skeptics and Christian nationalism rejectors on the other hand. So about 2 to 1, the country leans against those things. But what we find, and I think particularly to the election cycle, in our kind of two-party system here, that we do find that among Republicans there's a majority, 54%, that agree that are in that category of Christian nationalism, either adherents or skeptics, and the numbers are way down in the teens for Democrats. So we see this very big spread among our two parties on that question.
Republicans are adherents or not skeptics, but
adherents or sympathizers. Yes,
sympathizers.
Sorry. Thank you. Yes.
Really interesting. So just to kind of parse out some of the words, Christian nationalism is, a 2-word phrase, and to break out each of those words, the Christian and the nationalism, obviously not all Christians are Christian nationalists, and not all Christian nationalists are white supremacists, yet Christian nationalism tends to be a racialized phenomenon, very linked to white Christians as opposed to Black Christians or Latinx Christians, for example. So talk to us about how this plays out in the studies you've published for PRRI.
Yeah. Well, first we should just ground this, I think, in the history of this country. If we think about, and this is part of the work that I do in the latest book, the kind of claims to cultural dominance in this country have always been an ethno-religious claim, right? What I mean by that, they've always been racial and religious. They've not just been one or the other. And so like maybe an example that's really close and maybe the most familiar, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And everybody thinks of the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK as anti-Black, and of course that's true. But what I think people often forget is that the KKK wasn't just anti-Black, it was anti-Catholic and it was anti-Jewish, right? Now what makes all of that, what holds all of that together? Well, the thing that holds all of that together was this positive affirmation of what true Americans, real Americans were, and that was that they were white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant Christians, right? That's the reason why there was anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, and certainly anti-Muslim and all of that. But I think that's the history that's kind of come forward for us, and that's always kind of been the claim to dominance. And you can see that history play out in the current statistics as well, right? So things that are correlated, for example, with higher scores on the Christian nationalism scale, or kind of denials of systemic racism, for example, kind of disbelief that there is any lingering effects of kind of discrimination against African Americans, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim views, and also kind of hierarchical or patriarchal gender views. Like those things are all positively correlated with this kind of worldview of Christian nationalism.
Right. And to dig down deeper into Christian nationalism, you said it was not a new thing. It does have tremendous precedent in the history of the U.S. And just to ask, is Christian nationalism sort of created as a new word for something that's very old? Is the studying of it creating Christian nationalism, or is this perhaps, in what way is Christian nationalism different? I'm thinking from what European origin Christianity has been really since initial contact with the Americas in the 16th century. How continuous has it been? How has it changed? How is it something old but now new?
Yeah, well, I'll give one concrete example of kind of the ways in which Christian nationalism has been part of the kind of founding myth of the country. So I live in Washington, D.C., and in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, there are a set of paintings around the rotunda. They're huge. They're 8 feet by 12 feet paintings around the rotunda. One of them features Hernando de Soto, who discovering the Mississippi River, right, in 1541. And it's this big painting, and if you look at it, it's got De Soto in his kind of conquistador finery, right, with his white horse, and he's got cannons and soldiers and weapons kind of around him on the left side of the painting. And as you follow the painting around, he's riding his horse into an indigenous village, right? So these Native Americans gathered around, and they're sort of like cowering, right, around his big horse. And if you follow it around, the thing that's on the other side of the painting, there's a cannon here, and on the other corner, there's about a 20-foot crucifix being raised in the middle of this indigenous village, right? So this is that claim, right? This kind of divine, these lands as a kind of divinely ordained promised land for European Christians. So you've got the symbols of violence and occupation, you've got the symbols of Christianity, kind of all wrapped up, there together. And this hangs as one of our founding myths in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol today, right? So it still is doing a kind of myth-making work. So, to your question, I think the closest proximity we have, it's like another word that was used recently to describe a similar phenomenon, was the Christian right, or the religious right. And that was kind of a movement of the 70s and 80s in the U.S. And it was essentially the kind of resurgence of white evangelicals into national politics, right, around Reagan and in that kind of era going forward. I think the reason why we have a new term is that this is a little bit different than that, right? There was a kind of, they used the words like moral majority in that era, but what this is a kind of a more overt claim to dominion and power, I think, and I think it's a little bit different, and even violence, I think, in its current iteration. We find, for example, that those who are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers are about 2.5 times likely as other Americans to say that political violence might be necessary in order to save the country, right? And I think that edge of it is a more militant edge to it. I think is something that's kind of new.
That makes sense. And just to go to the white supremacy component of it, because of course Europeans in the 16th century were not self-describing as white. They were describing as, colonists of the Spanish crown or the French crown or the English crown. And so how does whiteness emerge, or how does it manifest now as the way people identify, talk about Christian nationalism, where it's almost always already a phenomenon of whiteness as well as Christianity and what they call patriotism?
Well, some of you probably studied, right, the kind of development of the concept of white, right, and how it kind of comes into play, and it's an invented concept. I mean, James Baldwin was really, I think, helpful to me in kind of making sense of this, where he would say, like, look, everybody thinks of themselves as white in this country. If you kind of trace your ancestry back far enough, your ancestors weren't. If you go back far enough, they were British, or they were French, or they were German, right, or they were Dutch, right? That's that was the ethnic identity. But what happened is that, in this context where all of those European identities were sort of being mixed, and with the transatlantic slave trade, whiteness became a kind of useful shorthand really for the power structures that out of Europe, and it really became to be, white versus black, became this kind of binary, right? That's really become so powerful, even though it's absolutely a human construct. And if you kind of think about it pretty quickly, you're like, oh yeah. Like, my ancestry, I'm like Welsh and British for the most part, but grew up thinking of myself as white, right? Because that was the kind of operative kind of binary category that we have. So I think that sense, and you can see it in the data too. You can sort of see, again, not all people who identify as Christian nationalists on those surveys are white. But among those who are white, you could see it operating differently, right? So whiteness is the thing that is most connected to anti-immigrant sentiment. It's the thing that's most connected to anti-black sentiment and even anti-Semitism, right? It doesn't operate that way among Latinos and African Americans, even among those who share some of these sentiments about kind of Christian dominance. But that racial dominance does something quite different that sets up this us, and particularly it sets up this us and them kind of xenophobic line that we see that is more operative among white Americans.
You mentioned James Baldwin, and I will just put in the comment that Dr. Jones' Substack, which is whitetolong.net, takes its phrase, white too long, from the title of his first book, White Too Long, which actually is a phrase from James Baldwin, a searing phrase that James Baldwin spoke among many of his very moving phrases, but that comes straight from Baldwin.
Can I say I'll say a little bit about that. I was really struck. It comes from a New York Times article that James Baldwin wrote in the weeks after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He's writing and he's kind of just in anguish, right? And the reason why he's in anguish is because I think he really believed that in the wake of something like the assassination of this man leading this nonviolent, movement for equality, that white Americans would finally stand up on the side of civil rights, right? And that's not what happened, right? So of course, some did, but not. There wasn't this mass movement, right, of white citizens standing up and saying, "Oh no, we're not going to have this in this country." And the phrase, I'm going to not quite get it exactly right, but it's something like this. He's writing in that context, and he says, I've come to see that white Americans are beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They've been married to the lie of white supremacy too long, right? And it kind of goes on from there. But I took that phrase as something to kind of take seriously, right? And to kind of try to write back, as somebody who looks like me and with my background, to write back into that kind of indictment, really, of Baldwin's. Yep.
Thanks for sharing that. You mentioned something earlier, which is that a patriarchal notion of relationship between the genders is also a component that correlates very strongly with Christian nationalism, especially white Christian nationalism. And my question is, why is the traditional gender binary so important to white Christian nationalists?
Well, I think if you think back, at first glance, it does seem like, well, why is that? Like, why does the gender stuff kind of come along for the ride here, or how is it connected? But if you kind of think back to the worldview again, and the deeper structure of this worldview, it's very hierarchical and it's very ordered. And so if you think about that, so there is this idea, right, in this worldview that God creates everything in a very ordered and set way, and it's hierarchical, right? And so there are men over women, there is white over non-white, there's Christian over non-Christian, and it is all of these hierarchies that get set, and there's kind of these boxes, right? And that if you find yourself, born into one of these set pieces, then your mission is to live out your life in that role, right? It's not to move out of that role. It's not to question the categories. And to do so, in fact, would be to kind of violate God's will. Like that's how this is all set up. And so this idea of kind of men over women, these kind of hierarchical gender roles fit very well with, and so if you think about, if you've studied Southern, history, antebellum history, right, there is this very sense of men were public, women were private in the kind of domestic sphere, and that fit very hand in glove with white over black, right? So I think it's about hierarchies and fixed social roles that really can't be questioned.
Right, and if you mess with one of them, you've messed with all of them.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the whole scheme comes falling down, right, if you mess with one of them.
Right. So another component that maybe to outsiders of the worldview is hard to understand. So if a core freedom of the United States Constitution is religious freedom, and very self-described pro-American white Christian nationalists are all about the freedoms of America, how is it that there's frequent talk as if non-Christian people in the United States who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Sikh, who are Hindu, who are Buddhist, should not be and maybe cannot be part of the country?
Well, I think the thing to understand is that this worldview is not democracy. It's not a democratic worldview. It's a theocratic worldview. And I think one of the kind of pieces in our recent politics we've seen is there's this thing's been all over the news, right? But I think it's a real clue, and kind of a cultural clue in Project 2025, which is a kind of project of the Heritage Foundation. And there's like these little clues about, if you hear how they talk about liberty, they talk about ordered liberty, right? They sneak in the word ordered in front of liberty. And then they say, look, our liberty is not to behave however we want. It's to behave how we ought, right? Spelled out there. Now, who gets to decide, right, how we ought to behave? Well, I think in this worldview, it is this kind of Christian nationalism worldview, right? So a very particular, overtly white evangelical version of the world is like, that's what determines how we ought to behave. And from that worldview, that's what the state protects, right? Not broad liberty in the way that we can think about from the Constitution, but it's a sort of subtle word game with like fairly radical implications.
Thank you for that. You mentioned political violence before, that there is a correlation, again, between Christian nationalism and a willingness to ponder the possibility or necessity of political violence to save our country. And that brings me to what happened on January 6th, 2021, when the U.S. Capitol was attacked by people hoping to stop the certification of the presidential election victory of Joe Biden by the joint session of Congress. So many of them carried signs and symbols and declared slogans aligning themselves with Christian nationalism. What do your studies find about various Americans' opinions about political violence at this moment when we are only a few weeks from the election of the next president and only a few months away from the certification of that election?
Well, first of all, I'm saying, so I live 5 miles from the Capitol, right? So this is all very like personal. I was there, like, I saw it. I stayed up late that night and wrote a piece called "Taking the Religious Symbols at the Insurrection Seriously." That was published in Religion News Service on January 7th, because it was so disturbing to me to see crosses, Bible verses, and in some cases marching side by side with Confederate flags, right, and with weapons, and the violence, right? People lost their lives, right? Were injured. Police officers were attacked. So it was. And I think there were crosses. There were the Christian flag, which kind of the National Council of Churches adopted. It's a white flag, has like a blue canton little square up in the corner, and a red Latin cross, and it was marched through the breached Senate chamber with the Confederate flag, right, on that day. So like seeing those things, and those people weren't arguing with each other, right? They were marching in the same cause. And so I think taking all of that really, really seriously, what does that mean? I mean, there were Christian songs being sung, prayers over megaphones, right? Christian prayers being said that day. So I think all of that mix tells us, right, what it was. I mean, it was a kind of Christian nationalist justified attempt at an insurrection in the country. And, when you think about this, there's a couple of things to, I think, kind of, if we take a step back and just to remember that Christian nationalism, by its very nature, one of the reasons why it's anti-democratic is because it's given up on ends and it's pursuing it's giving up on means and it's pursuing ends. So democracy is a commitment to means, right? It's a commitment to fair play, fair elections, free elections, and it's a commitment to lose if your side doesn't bring in enough votes, right? That's democracy. But what I think the thing that we're seeing is that the thing that Christian nationalism can't make space for is a potential loss, right? Because they've equated the end with something that God demands. And when you've kind of raised the politics to that level, I think that's what opens the door to violence, right? If the end is something that God is dictating, and the only possible end is that your side wins, then that means that almost any means possible are on the table, right? And that's really the thing that I think really undermines democracy. And I guess the last thing I'll say on this too is that it means that it changes how you think of your fellow citizens. So rather than thinking of your fellow citizens as, just that, fellow citizens with whom you may have very deep disagreements, like that's democracy, right? I may be very angry, right? And I'm trying to like outflank, outmaneuver, use tactics and get out my people more than your people and to win a vote, right? But at the end of the day, if I lose, I have to kind of think, okay, well, I lost, I'm going to regroup and I'll try again next time, right? We'll have another election, I'll try again. But I'm still thinking of people as my fellow citizens, even if I really disagree with them. The real challenge with the Christian nationalist worldview is that it stops thinking of people that are on the other side of a political question or a political party as fellow citizens and starts thinking of them as agents of evil. And once you sort of dehumanize people and you think of them as literally being in league with the devil, right, then it's not enough, right, to sort of defeat them in an election. You've got to kind of vanquish them from the country, right? They're a threat to the very country's existence. And again, it's just, this is so corrosive to the very idea of civic friendship and democracy and the things on which, a healthy democratic society depends.
For sure. The question raised by the phrase Christian nationalism and what you're describing right now might leave some people in the room who are themselves Christian, me too, with an internal shuddering to be associated that, this is Christianity or this is part of Christianity. And sometimes when people who are religious don't like what other people in their religion are doing, they will say, for example, oh, well, Christian nationalists are not real Christians, and sort of segregate themselves from what's going on there. So are Christian nationalists Christians? Are they real Christians?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple ways to go on this, but so I grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi. So deep, deep South. My family, 200 years goes back in the South in Mississippi and in Georgia. The tradition that I grew up in was a tradition, like the Southern Baptist Convention was founded in 1845 explicitly to declare that the gospel of Jesus Christ was compatible with enslaving other people on the basis of the color of their skin. Right? That's the beginning history of my home denomination. I went to public school, but then I went to a Baptist college, right, out of that tradition. I have a degree from a Baptist seminary out of that tradition. So I've drunk pretty deeply from the well. I can assure you that we thought of ourselves as real Christians, right? Even being on the wrong side of an issue so awful, right, as slavery. And I think back about that. When you go back and you read the kind of 19th century debates between abolitionists, Christians, and Christians who were defending slavery, what you realize is that the Christians who were defending slavery thought they had the better biblical case. Right? It was the abolitionists who were having to reach for more abstract principles like equality and love and like those things. But like you can read, you can cite chapter and verse on slaves obey your masters, like those kinds of things right out of the text. And so, I think the way to think about this, and this is sort of my theological hat, is I don't know that it really does us much good to say, oh, well, people that we don't like how they're behaving, they're not really Christian, right? I think what it does to us is like, oh, well, they're Christianities. in the country, right? And we should think about it that way. I think just like there are multiple expressions of Islam or Buddhism or Sikhism, or there are all these varieties, right? And I think every generation is living into a new expression, and that's kind of what every generation is responsible for, is to live out what they see as the best of that tradition. The one other thing I want to make sure I say here is that when I'm talking about kind of being critical of Christian nationalism, I want to be clear, I'm not saying anything about the kind of public place of religion, right? There's all kinds of places where religion can express itself publicly, people organizing through churches, all of that. We have a long history of that in this country. The line really becomes when it becomes something about dominion, right? And kind of a kind of entitlement and dominion and control at the expense of other people's equality in the country. So I think that's the one distinction I want to make sure I make. And so that distinction and the one about saying, I want to say, that's real Christianity, even if we disagree with it, and that's real Christianity, even if we may agree with it. And taking them both because otherwise, I think we don't take it seriously, and clearly the people following it do.
Right. Thank you so much. So, given that this is a room that it's getting informed about Christian nationalism and may be across the political spectrum itself, still there might be a question as to, well, someone who's Christian nationalist is kind of in it, and someone who's against Christian nationalism is also against it. It's so polarized, and everybody has chosen their side already. So what would be the purpose of having this discussion, of studying the Christian right, of studying Christian nationalism at this moment in history, if everyone's already made up their minds? Is it to save Christianity from itself, because it is still by far the majority religion in the country? Is it to change hearts and minds, maybe not of the diehards, but of people who have come into the orbit of Christian nationalism, maybe without necessarily thinking through all of the implications? What is the purpose of studying it? Why do you study it?
That's a great question. A good one to kind of round out on. I think it links to what I was saying before. I think it's because every generation, I think, has a responsibility to kind of take kind of all the stuff we receive, right, and try to live into the best version of it. And that includes our kind of religious traditions. It includes our political traditions. And, I think back to kind of the founders of the country, and we walked past the statue of Benjamin Franklin earlier on campus over here. I don't know why it's here, but we walked past one earlier, and when he was asked, what kind of government do we have right after the signing of the Constitution, he says, a republic, if you can keep it. Right, and I think that sense of if you can keep it is about a kind of renewal that has to happen, because there's just always these winds of power and things to distort both religious and political traditions that blow through every generation. They're always a little bit different, and it's up to us that are living in the times we're in, I think, to try to navigate those, kind of save ourselves from their excesses, and hopefully, hand something better down to the next generation. So I think that's why we said to get clarity about it. And I think history, I'll give a religious studies plug here, and kind of seeing all this against a historic backdrop does help us say, oh, okay, there's a way in which we've, our kind of forebears had to struggle not with the same question, but with a similar question. And sometimes they got it right, and sometimes they get it wrong, right? And we can kind of see those implications. But I think it's useful and clarifying for us to kind of help us see, oh, wait, there's been this struggle between these. And for me, the way it kind of gets really clear for me is there's been this struggle since before the country, since Europeans set foot on these lands. There's been this struggle between, are these lands of, by, and for European Christians? Is that what these lands are? Is that what this country is? Or there was kind of a newer answer to that question. It's still hundreds of years old. Or are we somehow trying to create something like a multi-faith, kind of multi-religious, multiracial, pluralistic democracy, right? And these two things have been kind of in tension and wrestling with each other for most of our history here. And that's helpful for me, too, to think, okay, yeah, but we've got a responsibility to try to answer that question in a way that preserves, I think, democracy going down for the next generation.
So I am going to pause and just say I have one more question for Dr. Jones, myself, but think of your questions and feel free to start lining up at the mic in the center aisle. We have plenty of time for student questions, all questions, but students with priority. And so feel free to make your way to the center mic. My last question comes from listening to Dr. Jones in his radio and TV appearances, reading the Substack, whitetolong.net, and listening to the Convocation Unscripted for these many months. And he said over and over and over as a professional pollster that no one should pay attention to polls before Labor Day. No polls except those in the swing states matter. And no poll that falls within a 6-point margin of error can tell you anything. Okay, so it's after Labor Day, and the swing state polls have come out recently, and it is October 10th. So what do you say now about the 2024 presidential election?
I thought I was going to get out without that question. All right, I thought I'd run the gauntlet. So yes, all of that is true. And here's the thing is, this election is so close. It's remarkably close. And so, we have our last pre-election poll at PRRI coming out next Wednesday. For those of you who want to tune in, we're going to be unveiling the results at the Brookings Institution at 10:30 a.m. next Wednesday. We will have A.B. Stoddard from The Bulwark on the panel, Joy Reid from MSNBC on the panel, E.J. Dionne from Brookings, and Bill Galston from Brookings, all on the panel, along with me and PRRI CEO Melissa Deckman. So it should be a really great discussion. So I haven't said all that. I spent all my time looking at polls and numbers, but there is nothing I have seen so far in the polls that is telling me anything about who's going to win this election. Right? That's just the truth. And so here's a couple of hints. I'm going to reemphasize one that you said. So for the presidential election, because it's about the Electoral College, there really are only 7 states that are going to determine the outcome of the election. Like that much the polls have told us. So, up this way, it is Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, right? That's the kind of Midwest swath. In the South, it's Georgia and North Carolina. And in the Southwest, it's Nevada and Arizona, right? Outside of those states, that's kind of it. The ones that are really going to determine. And when you look at, and I tend to not look at just a single poll, but I try to look at the polling averages. So there's several places you can look. The New York Times, 538, Real Clear Politics. There's a bunch of them that aggregate. The Washington Post aggregates polls. And so I look at the kind of averages. And when you look at those averages, the better ones of those sites put a little error cloud around the trend line. So you can kind of see the trend line, but then there's this fuzzy little cloud around it. And what you know by that is how much error there is possibly in those polls. And if you don't see a lot of white space between the blue cloud and the red cloud, and so far we do not see white space between those two little clouds in any of the swing states, it's a toss-up, right? So there's no such, I just say this over and over, there's no such thing as a 2-point lead. There's no such thing as a 3-point lead, because most of these polls have a margin of error of 3 to 4 percentage points among likely voters. Right, so you're going to have to see something like a 6 or 7 point gap between Harris and Trump before you can confidently know, okay, somebody's actually leading or somebody's actually losing. And so far, it's kind of astonishing, but so far that gap has not appeared. So it really is a toss-up, kind of in all across those seven polls. And one other caveat to this too is that, in particular, when you see somebody looking at a single poll and looking at a subgroup in a single poll, like only comparing men, or in particularly, one that's going to be really hot is Latino men or black men. Where are they? You should really take that with a grain of salt, because the margin of error on those numbers is probably 10 to 12 points, because they are a subgroup of the whole poll's probably only got 800 people. and are aided or unlikely voters. And so you start breaking it down to like African Americans and then only men, you're down to like 150, 175 people. And so you just can't make broad sweeping conclusions. So all of the subgroup stuff I would take with a grain of salt unless it's like 15 to 20 point differences there.
You got it hot off the press here.
But those don't make great headlines. That's why we get these kind of clickbaity headlines. They're up by 2, right? No, they're not up by 2.
Thanks so much. And we're open for questions. Please make your way to the center mic and ask a few questions. Thanks so much.
Hello.
And if everyone could say your name and where you are located in the university. Yes.
My name is Ritika Singh. We met earlier this morning. And I'm a religion and contemporary issues major. My question was, what kind of role do you think, if any, should religion play in politics?
So, we have church, what's often called separation of church and state, but it's not separation of kind of public life and religion. I think that's really clear. So, there's all kinds of legitimate kind of even lobbying organizations, right, that represent either denominations. Like there's only one religious building on Capitol Hill, and it's the United Methodist Building. It was built there like in the 1920s. It's right next to the Supreme Court, right across from the Capitol. And it was built there to influence public policy, right? And in fact, its initial mission was temperance, right? That was the mission. It was Methodist women wanting to get temperance laws passed. Like that's a perfectly legitimate, thing to kind of lobby for. Again, so I think ways of using influence and kind of through a democratic process, like all of that is great, fair game, and kind of what a kind of democratic society looks like. I think it's really trying to seize kind of power and to kind of limit power to kind of one particular religious group. That is where we start running into trouble. And I just want to say, if anyone wants to see, they can see you about joining the Religious Studies Club, right?
Yes.
I'll give that plug too, right? Yeah. All right, yeah.
Hi, good evening. My question is, if Trump loses, do you believe another insurrection will occur? And if it does, do you think it would be more violent than before?
I don't know. I'll tell you what I do know. This is an interesting question. So again, we're releasing some new data next week, so I do know it, but I can't talk about it quite yet. But there's some other data that we have that is close to this. We released a poll on authoritarianism and violence a few weeks ago at Fordham University at an event at Fordham in New York. And what we've kind of found there is that there's a set of things that are connected here. And so with Christian nationalism, people who do believe in that view, like I said, are about 2.5 times more likely than other Americans to say that they believe violence might be justified in order to save the country. One of the disinformation that we're seeing is also a danger. So one big piece is sort of the idea that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. Like that's also a pretty heavy predictor of people who are more likely to support political violence. And we asked a new question too that is just in this last survey that's not just about violence, but it basically was saying, look, if your preferred candidate, whether that's Harris or Trump, loses the election, do you think they should declare the results to be invalid and try to reach office by any means necessary? And like on that question, we're seeing about 1 in 4, nearly 1 in 4 Republicans say yes to that question. It's down about 13% of Democrats saying yes to that question. So that's a scary prospect when you sort of say, like, no, okay, we're going to acknowledge that we lost, but we're going to try to take office anyway. I mean, that's a coup, right? And so I'm a little worried about that. I'm also worried about this, and this is not a polling thing, but I am a little worried about violence on Election Day. And the scenario that I'm really worried about is there's been a lot of calls for armed people to show up at polling places as so-called poll watchers, right? And that, I think, is a recipe for intimidation, a recipe for, again, a kind of anti-democratic practice, because it really is about intimidation. It's more likely to happen at majority African-American polling places as well. And that, I think, could lead to some very tense situations that could result, right? And some people will be armed to the teeth. One shoving match goes wrong, right? And we've got a body count.
Sorry, I had another question, but not everyone's happy with the Harris or Trump. So I was wondering how you think third-party voters will affect the election, especially in swing states.
It's a great question. It was a livelier question, 3 months ago than it is today. But now with kind of the third party, I guess Jill Stein's still in, and Cornel West, I guess, is technically still in. But we've kind of Robert Kennedy's off the ballot, which is kind of the biggest X factor in this election. So I don't think it's going to be as big a factor. But here's the thing: in those states that I named, like historically. Even in like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all put together in 2020, there was only about like 90,000 votes across all three of those states that swung the election one way or the other, right? So it doesn't take much when the election is that close to it. So can't discount it altogether, even if it's only 1 or 2%. If it's in the right place, it could certainly make a difference. But I think that the biggest factor is going to be turnout. Right, is which party can kind of turn themselves out. One quick, I can't resist saying this too, that I think this election is also showing us like how much better it would be if we had some viable third parties in this country. Right, it would just kind of give people more choices. It would kind of spread out. I think the kind of ideological divides wouldn't be kind of as binary and kind of stark as they are in this country. But it is what we have, at least so far. Yep.
How you doing? My name is Ben, and I'm from the Liberal Arts College. How do you believe Christian nationalism relates to modern-day anti-Semitism?
Well, it's fairly clear in the data. So we actually asked about this. We asked a set of questions that have been developed in kind of the sociological study of anti-Semitism. So we fielded those on a survey along with our Christian nationalism measures. And essentially what we saw is if you look at kind of average American kind of responses on those measures of anti-Semitism, and you compare those who are kind of Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, they bump up those measures of anti-Semitism by about 20 percentage points. So there's a positive correlation that gives you about a 20% more likelihood of kind of believing anti-Semitic things based on Christian nationalist views.
I'm not a student, but can I? I'm from Japan, and I came here like more than 30 years ago, and I was attending NYU, and my European friend, and then we were just amazed that abortion is an issue in American politics, and we were talking like, I mean, we just couldn't believe. And then in very conservative European, Catholic countries, I mean, abortion is no longer. It seems that abortion is no longer a big issue in the politics. And then, so my particular, so I would like your comment on this. I mean, how come in this country there is so much religious, religion is so influential into the politics? And then another question, and then my particular question is that the Supreme Court no longer honor this Roe v. Wade. And I'm wondering that women voters, if this Supreme Court decision is affecting female voters in these 7 states in any way.
That's a great question. Abortion politics are really interesting right now, right? So they were pretty set for like 40, 50 years following Roe v. Wade. And there was kind of this alignment where for 40 years, for example, the Republican Party platform had one of its planks every time they kind of renewed it was a national ban on abortion, right? And it was based on this belief that life began at conception. If that's what you believe, then that kind of follows, right, that you would have a national ban on abortion. What's remarkable, and like, I don't think I thought in my lifetime I would see a Republican politician at the top of the Republican ticket be able to touch that plank and survive, right? It's kind of the third rail, but we've seen it happen, right? So yes, Trump supported Supreme Court judges that then overturned Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision a few years ago, but it didn't turn into a national ban on abortion, and and Trump has kind of parked it at that space, right? He said, like, we want to leave it to the states. That's where we're in. And so the Republican Party platform in 2020, it was the first time that ban on abortion was not in the Republican Party platform. It's also, well, they didn't even have a platform in 2020. It was essentially, yes, what that guy believes was their platform. But in 2024, they do have a very odd platform that reads kind of like Trump tweets in many ways. Even the capitalization is like that. But it doesn't have a ban on abortion anymore in the Republican Party. It basically is Trump's position that would strike down Roe v. Wade, leave it up to the states. But that's not the pro-life position at all, right, writ large. So kind of that's really interesting to me. And the other thing that I would say is that what we've seen among Republicans is that two issues have kind of switched places. Is that when we ask people now what the most critical issue to their vote is, Republicans no longer say abortion. That used to be kind of high on the list. Immigration has taken its place, right? So abortion has gone down, immigration has come up, and we see the opposite thing. For the first time ever since the Dobbs decision, we see Democrats saying abortion's a more important issue to them than Republicans. And like, again, my lifetime, it's always been Republicans saying that's a more important issue. But now we actually see Democrats, and particularly Democratic women, saying that is one of the most important voting issues. So that those politics have kind of been scrambled since the Dobbs decision.
Hi, so my name's Abigail. I'm a major in the religion and contemporary issues. I'm also a major in psychology. I went to high school at Dover Area School District in Pennsylvania, which is known for having creationism in its science curriculum, or it did for a long time. I'm kind of curious how you think, like, what is the legal pathway for white nationalists to kind of bring creationism, Christianity back into schools? Is there a legal pathway for that currently? Would that require a lot of overhaul? What do you think about that?
Well, there's a lot of those little probing things going on. So one just recently that many of you may have seen is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Ryan Walters, who's the school superintendent there, has put in an order that every classroom has to have a Bible in the classroom, and these are public schools, right? Now, what's interesting is that when you start looking a little into the details, it's not just any Bible, and like, let me kind of remind everybody, in case it's not clear, that one, not all Christians read the same Bible. Certainly, not even all Protestants read the same Bible, but certainly Catholics and Protestants don't read the same Bible. There's actually different books in Catholic versions of the Bible that the Protestants don't recognize and include. But this one is it's the King James Version of the Protestant Bible is the one that ended up getting put into the regulations and their official request for proposals. And not only that, he went on to describe exactly what this Bible had to have in it. It had to have, in addition to being the King James Version of the Bible, it had to have the Declaration of Independence in it. It had to have the Constitution in it. And it turns out like nobody publishes a Bible like that except for one. Anybody know what it is? It's the Trump Bible, right? Is the only one that has all that stuff between two covers. So it's this kind of weird, that's like the most overt way of kind of, putting literally the nation's founding documents inside the leather cover of sacred texts. You can't get more Christian nationalist than that, right? And then inserting it into public schools. So I think we're seeing pretty blatant attempts in many ways to kind of do that. Yeah.
Hi, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Diana. I'm a computer science major. My next question is, how did Christian nationalism resurrect post 9/11? And how does this, as well as neo-Nazis and the KKK, play a role today as well?
All right. I was a math and computer science major, so right on. As an undergrad. Yeah, so I mean, I think that the link there is certainly, what we saw with the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment right after 9/11. So that plays into this as well. That's one of the correlates that I mentioned earlier. Along with anti-Semitism, along with anti-black racism, there is anti-Muslim sentiment, and certainly we've kind of heard that rhetoric, even recently here. And so I think that key, and the way it fits really is, again, like, so who's a real American? Right, that question, right? And again, it has a kind of racial, ethnic, and religious component to it from that Christian nationalist standpoint. So kind of by definition, if you're not Christian, right, you're not kind of in that real American category. So I think that's kind of how that has flowed kind of into our current politics. It kind of gets subsumed, I think, into kind of the general xenophobic anti-immigrant rhetoric of Christian nationalism, but it's certainly there, and you can hear that specific note getting struck from time to time.
We have time for another question. Is there any more question from the floor? Hi, Dr. Libresco.
Hello. If a student wants to ask, I'm happy to give up my spot. Anybody? Okay. I'm Andrea Libresco, and I teach in the School of Ed and head the civic engagement minor, and I'm currently teaching a course on the elections. So something that arises in our class is that I'm struck by your ends means discussion, and that then by extension that the end is Trump at the end of that. Certainly back when Reagan was running and the moral majority favored Reagan, yet he was divorced, the first divorced president. How naive and cute that is now, right? But Trump certainly has a lot of baggage that would not be deemed traditionally Christian, right? That's the euphemism I can use. And so I'm curious, genuinely curious how that happened. I know he got rid of Roe v. Wade, so I know that's a big reason to ignore other things. But still, he seems a pretty imperfect messenger as the end when it's dominion, and you think that this person who's, got convictions for various things that don't seem very Christian, it's just, that's a hard connection and a hard leap to make. So I'm wondering how people cross that divide.
I've probably spent more time answering this question in the last 10 years than any other question. I thought about it a lot. I think that it is a very, like early on when Trump first hit the scene, I remember looking back at, we actually did a survey before Trump ever got the nomination back in 2015. And his favorability rating among white evangelicals before he became the Republican nominee was like 42%. As soon as he became, and then we took that was like just months before he became the nominee. As soon as he becomes the nominee, his favorability went from 42% to 75%, right, over that one summer. So there's a little bit of a clue there. And then the other kind of stunning finding that we found is that we asked a question in 2011, so well before Trump is on the scene, about candidates' character and how much it mattered. And so we asked the question this way. It was like, do you think that an elected official who commits an immoral act in their private life can still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public life? Do you agree or disagree? But that's possible. And what we found in 2011 is that when we asked white evangelical Protestants that question, only 32% of them agreed with that statement in 2011. You can see where I'm going, right? We asked that again in 2016 with Trump at the top of the ticket, and it went from 32% saying, yeah, I guess we could think that's possible, to 72% saying that was possible. So this kind of rejection of the importance of character was just like very easily set aside. Now, still why, like how, right, is still the question. And I think the answer to that is not in, there was a lot of time spent when Trump first got the candidacy of like, how can we explain him as one of us, right? And there was all these kind of tortured explanations. Well, he's a baby Christian. He's other kinds of things that never really stuck. And Trump himself shrugged them off. But I think what really came, for me, the interview that I heard that really made it make sense was I heard a debate between two evangelical ministers on NPR, and they were asking this question. And it was Russell Moore, who was the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. He's like the head lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he was saying, no way, under any circumstances, could we support a candidate with Trump's background and character. And then the other person was the pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas, Robert Jeffries. And Jeffries was on the other side, and he just said, look, the world is in such bad shape that when I think about who we need and want in the White House on our side, we want the meanest son of a you-know-what we can find, and that's Trump. And so this is the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, a huge kind of tall steeple church in Texas. I was like, okay, that's it. It is really this instrumental connection, right? It's not about values. It's not about shared values. It's not about he's one of us. But it's like, but we're under threat. And if you listen to Trump's speech, he gave a speech to the National Religious Broadcasters in February, which is a group of kind of the big radio, TV station owners in the Christian kind of evangelism world. And there he basically said, look, I know you're under assault. I know your churches are emptying. But if you elect me, I will restore power to the Christian churches, right? I will give you back your power. And it's just that instrumental, I think, is there's a sense that, and it's true that like white Christianity is declining in this country, right? So we've gone in the last 20 years from being a majority white Christian country. 2008, it was 54%. Today, it is 41%. If you take all white Christians together, like that's what and evangelicals went from being nearly a quarter of the country 20 years ago to 13% of the country today, right? So that's its core appeal. So that kind of decline, I think, sets off a kind of desperation where political ethics of principle just gets set aside for kind of ends justify the means kind of political ethic. And I think it's basically that straightforward.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones is going to make his way back to the table to sign books, to talk with anyone who has further questions. But for now, I just want to, one more question. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to talk, because it's really interesting if you look at the history of Donald Trump and the amount of people who have either backed him that have ties to Christian nationalism, or that he has backed people who have ties to Christian nationalism, and now, only now, within this election, has he kind of said, no, I'm actually not a Christian nationalist. I stand with some of these other communities. I stand with the Jewish community. I stand with some of these other minority communities. I'm actually not this. I'm a really good guy. And so I think it's really interesting that you have this person who has such a long history of doing these things and saying these things, and either being backed by these people or backing these people, whether directly or indirectly. And then he, at face value, can just say, no, I'm not like that. I actually support these other communities, and other people will believe it and say, yeah, no, that's true, without fact checking or looking at the history and any of this other stuff.
Why is he
How
suddenly
is he
switching?
able to do
Yes.
that?
Yes.
And why is he suddenly switching for that?
Yes.
Well, I think it's like most politicians, they're looking at the polls, right? And the polls are just tight. I mean, it's down. I think it's going to come down to, like I said, it could come down to as little as 10,000 votes in a whole state. So I think it's just a kind of politically pragmatic move on his part to kind of muddy the water. I mean, that's always kind of been a strategy, to kind of just muddy the water. You can't pin him down. Those kind of, so I think that's mostly what it's about.
Yeah, that's also what I think. So.
Thank you so much for all the questions. Thank you again to Dr. Jones, and let us thank him for being with us tonight. Really appreciate it.